Judge Christopher Greenwood, thank you again very much for having joined us for the International Summit here in The Hague. I think we really benefited greatly from your speech from earlier today. We'd love now to have the chance to ask you also a few follow-up questions and to go a little deeper into some of the issues we addressed earlier today. But first of all, thank you very much for having come.
It was a great pleasure, and I much enjoyed talking to the group this morning.
Excellent, excellent. Let me begin with the first question, really coming also, I guess, in particular with your role as a judge. In your role as a judge at the International Court of Justice, what in your experience represents the greatest barrier to ensuring adherence with international law, and what recommendations would you give for strengthening the capacity for international law to encourage the universal adoption of human rights?
Yes, I think from the standpoint of a judge here, the biggest barrier to adherence to international law is, of course, that there's only a restricted jurisdiction for international courts and tribunals. We can hear a case only if the parties to that case have at some stage given their consent. And what is often overlooked is it's not just a matter of whether there is an absolute absence of consent. It's often a question of whether there is consent only to a part of a dispute being heard. For example, we gave a judgment yesterday in which we had to begin by explaining that our jurisdiction was confined to the interpretation, application and fulfilment of the Genocide Convention. So we didn't have jurisdiction to determine whether war crimes or crimes against humanity, whether any violation other than genocide had taken place. And it would obviously please me to see a much greater acceptance on the part of states of our jurisdiction. I think it's sometimes overlooked that by avoiding becoming party to any of the jurisdictional provisions, states may protect themselves from being sued, but they also forego the opportunity for judicial validation of their own rights, their own claims.
That's true. That's true. I agree. I think it's one of the main challenges that we're facing today. Let me ask the second question. How do you think we can find the balance between universal international human rights law and respect for individual cultures, particularly when certain traditional cultural practices can be deemed as human rights violations? How do we balance the cultural aspect, so to speak?
Yes, I think that's a very difficult matter because there is an important balancing act. On the one hand, you have to avoid saying, well, in a particular environment it may be all right to commit breaches of the most fundamental human rights principles. Those core principles have got to be protected at all costs. On the other hand, I think it would be a mistake to end up with a one-size-fits-all mentality where essentially every society has got not only to respect human rights, but to respect them in the way and in the style that is, if you like, the central model. But there can never be a justification on cultural grounds for torture, for example. There can never be a justification for arbitrary detention and imprisonment. It's a matter, though, of what constitutes arbitrariness in any society. And that's why I think you do get a variation in the interpretation of some, not all, but some human rights to take account of cultural differences.
Cool. As a follow-up question, a common criticism of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is that it presents a Western definition of human rights standards. Do you feel that there's a sense among some non-Western nations that human rights are being imposed upon them? And if so, how do you feel that this can be overcome?
Well, I think it has to be met first and foremost by having a look at what are the rights in the Universal Declaration. I have a copy of the Universal Declaration to hand.
Okay.
What could be said to be peculiarly Western about everyone has the right to life, liberty and the security of person? There's nothing peculiar to one culture about no one shall be held in slavery or servitude. Slavery and the slave trade shall be prohibited in all their forms. No one shall be subjected to torture or to cruel, inhuman or degrading treatment. I think it would actually be the antithesis of a recognition of different cultures to start saying, well, some countries aren't ready for a prohibition on torture, or some societies don't really feel that strongly about slavery. Of course they do. At the same time, I think there is a problem that has arisen perhaps more from the tone in which Western nations and Western writers sometimes comment on human rights, which gives the impression that it is a peculiarly European or European and North American set of values. It isn't, and it shouldn't be seen as such. There is, of course, nothing wrong with having regional agreements. There's an African Human Rights Treaty, there's a European Human Rights Convention, and in each case they try to foster certain specific values of those continents. Fair enough. But have a look at the provisions themselves, and there is much more in common between them than there are differences between them.
Lastly, and this is obviously something related more to the work we do at the Institute, what do you think, or what role could cultural diplomacy play in the promotion of human rights?
I think it goes to that question of tone as much as anything else. Cultural diplomacy, as I understand it, is designed first and foremost to foster a greater degree of understanding between people in different cultures, different societies. And I think a greater understanding of that removes some of the stereotypes, some of the prejudices, if you like, about what human rights are, how they apply in a different environment.
Okay. And maybe as a related question to that, very often it's thought of that human rights, that's really the domains of international law. Now, they're really the only mechanism, so to speak, to enforce them is, let's say, the court or international laws. Do you think civil society also has a role to play? Whether it's through cultural diplomacy or other forms, how can civil society also support the protection and the promotion of human rights?
I'm very much in favour of civil society having an important part in the promotion of human rights. I think that one of the examples of a déformation professionnelle that lawyers suffer from is that we assume that only our way of doing things really works. Okay. Now, obviously, I believe in a strong international court of justice. I believe in the values of international law. But I'm also delighted when we're not necessary, when human rights standards are respected without the need to go to court. And I think there's an enormously important role there for civil society at all levels, not just big multinational NGOs, but the small groups that have grown up within individual societies that, for example, have tried to further the rights of orphan children or the rights of women, whatever the particular case may be.
Excellent. So there's a lot of work to be done, but I think each sector has its role to play. But thank you very much, Judge Greenwood, for having come, also for the interview, and we look forward to hopefully staying in dialogue with you and to collaborating in the future.
I hope so. It's very nice to see you again, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your stay in The Hague.
Thank you.
Thank
you.
you.
Pleasure meeting you. Thank you.